In the centre of London's most opulent ballroom, Lady Victoria Fairchild did not introduce Naomi Middleton as her stepdaughter. She pointed at the girl's threadbare rags and announced her to the glittering crowd as expired trash, available to the highest bidder. Naomi stood frozen, realizing she hadn't been brought here to dance, but to be liquidated. If this story has already drawn you in, if you feel the weight of unspoken longing and the promise of what is yet to come, then pause just a moment, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves stories where hearts are tested and destinies are rewritten. We publish new tales every day, each one richer, deeper, and more unforgettable than the last. Stay with us, because the best moments are always still ahead. To settle a ruinous gambling debt, Victoria was auctioning Naomi's very life like a broken horse, while her stepsister Isabel hid a cruel laugh behind a silk fan. Naomi waited for the floor to swallow her, praying for a social execution that would finally end her misery. But as the whispers turned to jeers, Brandon Reed, the 5th Duke of Oldham, stepped out of the shadows. Known as the Machine Duke for a heart rumoured to be made of unfeeling iron, he did not offer a hand of mercy. Instead, he tossed a single insulting gold coin at Victoria's feet. "I'll take the trash," he rasped, his gaze burning with a dark, terrifying purpose. While the Ton gasped at his supposed act of salvation, they failed to see the truth in his cold eyes. He hadn't purchased a bride to save her, he had acquired a weapon to destroy the very woman who sold her. The morning light that crept through the attic window of Fairchild Manor was pale and apologetic, as though it too understood it had no place disturbing the shadows. I woke to its timid touch across my face, blinking against the dust motes that danced in the narrow shaft of sun, the only luxury my sparse room afforded. I rose slowly, my body protesting the thin mattress and threadbare blankets that did little against the December chill. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I crossed to the washstand, where a cracked porcelain basin held water I'd carried up the previous night. It was cold now, biting against my skin as I washed my face, but I had long since stopped expecting warmth. The mirror above the washstand was small and fractured, a spiderweb crack running through its centre that split my reflection into fragments. I studied those fragments now, as I did most mornings, cataloguing what I saw with the detached precision of someone conducting an inventory. 28 years old, the thought arrived without particular emotion, simply a fact to be acknowledged. My dark hair, once lustrous, according to the miniature portrait of my mother I'd managed to hide from Victoria's purges, now seemed merely brown, practical, unremarkable. The pallor of my skin from too many hours indoors, away from the sun and society that had no use for me. The lines at the corners of my eyes from squinting in dim light while mending Isabel's endless wardrobe. Fading beauty, they would call it, past her prime. The words echoed in my mind, spoken so often by Victoria and Isabel that they'd worn grooves into my consciousness like water over stone. But as I met my own gaze in the fractured mirror, I knew the truth they refused to see. I was intelligent, far more educated than Isabel would ever be, thanks to the books my father had left behind before Victoria sold most of them. I was capable, managing half the household despite being given no authority and less respect. I was kind, or tried to be, even when kindness earned me nothing but more contempt. The world, however, saw only one thing: spinster, servant, expired trash. I dressed quickly in my serviceable grey gown, not one of two options, but my only option, the other having finally disintegrated beyond repair last month. The fabric was worn soft with age, the hem carefully mended where it had begun to fray. This dress had once belonged to my mother. Wearing it felt like armour, a reminder that I had once been someone who mattered.
Below me, through the thin floorboards, I could hear the sounds of the household stirring, the clatter of fine china in the breakfast room, china that had been my grandmother's, Isabella's laugh, bright and careless, Victoria's voice, imperious even at this early hour, demanding her chocolate be reheated. The sounds of a world that had no place for me except in service to it. I descended the narrow servants' stairs, emerging into the warmth and golden light of the main house. The contrast was immediate and deliberate. Where my attic room was all shadows and neglect, the rest of Fairchild Manor gleamed with polished wood and fresh flowers, maintained by the 3 remaining servants Victoria could barely afford but refused to dismiss. Appearances, after all, were everything. The breakfast room was bright with morning sun, the table laden with food I had helped cook prepare at dawn but would not be invited to share. Victoria sat at the head in rustling emerald silk, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. Isabel lounged beside her, still in her dressing gown, pretty and petulant as a spoiled cat. "There you are," Victoria said without looking up from her correspondence. "The chocolate is tepid. Fetch a fresh pot." "Of course, my lady," I murmured, moving to obey with the quiet efficiency I'd perfected over 8 years of servitude in what had once been my own home. "Honestly, Naomi, you move like a ghost," Isabel observed, examining her reflection in a silver spoon. "It's terribly unnerving, though I suppose at your age one does become rather spectral." "Isabel, please," Victoria said, though her tone held amusement rather than censure. "Your stepsister is hardly ancient, merely past marriageable age. There's a difference." My hands trembled slightly as I poured the fresh chocolate, but my face remained carefully blank. I'd learned years ago that reactions only encouraged them. Still, Isabel continued, warming to her subject as she always did when given an audience. "It is fortunate we allow her to stay. Where else would she go? No prospects, no dowry, no connections of her own." She turned to me with an expression of exaggerated sympathy. "You must be terribly grateful, sister dear." "I am aware of my situation," I replied quietly, setting the pot down with practiced care. Victoria finally looked at me, her pale blue eyes assessing and cold as winter ice. "Tonight is Isabel's triumph, Naomi, the Duke of Olden's Christmas ball. Every eligible gentleman in England will be there, and my daughter will shine like the diamond she is." She paused, letting the contrast hang unspoken in the air. "You will, of course, accompany us. Someone needs to manage Isabel's wraps and fetch refreshments. Consider it your contribution to this family that has housed and fed you despite your complete lack of value." "Yes, my lady." "And do try not to look so dreadfully pathetic," Victoria added, returning to her correspondence with dismissive finality. "Your moping reflects poorly on us all. If you cannot manage a pleasant expression, at least have the decency to remain invisible." Invisible. The word settled over me like a familiar cloak as I retreated from the breakfast room, my footsteps silent on the floors I had scrubbed on my hands and knees just yesterday. Tonight I would attend the grandest ball of the season, not as a guest, but as a shadow, not as my father's daughter, but as Victoria's unpaid servant. I would watch Isabel dance in gowns purchased with money stolen from my inheritance, would stand in corners holding her discarded fan and listening to the whispers about the tragic Middleton girl who had fallen so far. What I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly have anticipated as I climbed back up to my attic prison, was that tonight Victoria's cruelty would finally exceed the bounds of what even the heartless Ton could tolerate, and that the man they called the Machine Duke, a man rumored to have ice water in his veins and gears where his heart should be, would be the one to notice that the invisible girl in the corner was drowning. Some rescues, I would learn, don't come from princes on white horses. They come from men who understand what it means to be called a monster and who refuse to let anyone else be destroyed by the same cruelty that forged them.
The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Victoria's private sitting room as I entered with the tea service she'd demanded. This room had once been my mother's sanctuary, filled with her watercolors and pressed flowers. Now it was all severe elegance, dark furniture, heavy drapes, and the suffocating scent of Victoria's French perfume. Victoria sat at her escritoire, surrounded by papers that she swept hastily into a drawer as I approached, but not before I caught a glimpse of red ink, the color of debt, stamped across multiple documents. "Set it there," she commanded, without looking at me, "and remain. We have matters to discuss." My stomach tightened with apprehension. Victoria never kept me longer than necessary. I set down the tray with careful precision and stepped back, hands folded, eyes lowered in the posture of servitude I'd been trained to adopt. Isabel swept in moments later, still flushed from her afternoon ride, her riding habit the deep blue of sapphires. She threw herself onto the settee with careless grace, already reaching for the cakes I'd arranged. "Is this about tonight, Mamma? Because I've decided I absolutely must wear the pearl necklace, not the diamonds. Lord Ashford mentioned he adores pearls, and—" "This is about survival," Victoria interrupted, her voice sharp enough to slice. She turned to face us both, and I saw something in her expression I'd never seen before, fear, barely masked by her usual hauteur. Fear, barely masked by her usual hauteur. Our survival, to be precise. Isabel paused, a cake halfway to her mouth. "Whatever do you mean?" Victoria's jaw tightened, and for a moment she looked every one of her 43 years. "Your late stepfather's investments were not as sound as he believed, and my own expenditures over the past years have been necessarily substantial to maintain your position in society, Isabel." "Mamma," Isabel's voice had gone small, childlike. "We are in debt," Victoria said flatly. "Considerable debt, the kind that results in houses being seized, assets liquidated, families destroyed." She poured herself tea with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "I have been managing creditors for months, but Lord Pemberton, to whom I owe the largest sum, has lost patience. He demands payment, tonight." The words settled over the room like ash after a fire. I stood frozen, my mind racing through implications. The house, my father's house, the last tangible connection I had to him and my mother, it would be taken. "How much?" Isabel whispered. £5,000. Isabel gasped. I felt the air leave my lungs. It was a fortune, an impossible sum. "But surely we can sell something," Isabel said desperately. "The silver, the paintings, my jewelry." "Already promised to other creditors," Victoria said. "Everything of value has been quietly sold or mortgaged over the past year. What you see around you is largely illusion, borrowed finery and rented grandeur, designed to secure you a husband wealthy enough to save us all." "Then what are we to do?" Isabel's voice rose toward hysteria. "This is why," Victoria said, her gaze sliding toward me with predatory calculation, "we must make use of our available assets, all of them." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. I felt Victoria's attention on me like a physical weight, and something primal in my chest recognized danger. "Mamma!" Isabel followed her mother's gaze, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Lord Pemberton is a widower. His household is vast, his country estate even more so. He has been complaining for months about the difficulty of finding competent staff, particularly a housekeeper who can manage his properties with intelligence and discretion." "Lady Victoria, you did not give me permission to speak," she snapped, and I fell silent, years of conditioning making my jaw snap shut despite the scream building in my throat. "Lord Pemberton has agreed to forgive the debt, all of it, in exchange for a trained domestic servant, someone educated enough to manage accounts, literate enough to handle correspondence."
"You can't be serious," I breathed. "You intend to trade me like livestock to settle your debts." "Trade?" Victoria's laugh was cruel. "My dear Naomi, you flatter yourself. This is not a trade. This is disposal. You are expired trash that I am generously repurposing rather than simply casting into the gutter where you belong." The words hit like physical blows. I had endured 8 years of Victoria's casual cruelty, but this was erasure. She was selling me into indentured servitude, stripping away even the pretense that I was human rather than property. "You can't do this," I said, my voice shaking but growing stronger. "My father would never." "Your father is dead," Victoria said flatly, "and he left you nothing but debts and a name that means nothing less than nothing in this world. I have housed you, fed you, clothed you for 8 years. Consider this repayment for my extraordinary generosity." "Mamma," Isabel said uncertainly, "surely there's another way." "There is no other way," Victoria's composure cracked, revealing the desperation beneath. "Do you want to lose everything? Your season will be over, your prospects ruined, your future gone." She turned back to me, her expression hardening. "Naomi has no prospects, no future. She is simply existing, taking up space and resources. This arrangement gives her life purpose. She should be grateful." "Grateful," I repeated, the word tasting like poison. "You want me to be grateful that you're selling me as a slave?" "Pemberton has assured me you'll be treated well. Room and board, suitable clothing, even a small wage. It's more than you deserve. You're 28 years old, Naomi, unmarriageable, unwanted. This is the best offer you'll ever receive." I looked at Isabel, desperate for any sign of sympathy, of basic human decency. She met my gaze for a moment, and I saw something that might have been pity flicker across her features. But then she looked away, choosing her mother's protection over whatever vestige of conscience might have moved her to object. "The arrangement is settled," Victoria said with finality. "Tonight at the ball you will be presented to Lord Pemberton. He will inspect you, confirm you meet his requirements, and take possession immediately." She returned to her correspondence as though the matter was closed. "Now leave us. Find something presentable to wear. My reputation depends on you appearing at least minimally competent." I stood frozen for a moment, my mind unable to process what had just occurred. Then, moving as though through water, I walked from the room, my legs carrying me mechanically up the stairs to my attic prison. It was only when I reached my narrow bed that the reality crashed down upon me. I was to be sold, tonight, to a man I'd never met, to serve in his household with no choice, no agency, no escape. I was chattel, property, a debt instrument with a pulse, and there was absolutely nothing I could stop it. I sank onto the bed, my hands pressed against my mouth to muffle the sobs that threatened to escape. Because even now, even facing this ultimate degradation, I had been trained too well to make noise, to take up space, to matter. I was the invisible girl, and tonight I would disappear completely.
Brandon Reed, 5th Duke of Alden, sat in his study at precisely 8 o'clock in the evening, as was his custom. The room was organized with mathematical precision, books arranged by subject and size, correspondence sorted by urgency, even the fire built to provide optimal warmth without excessive fuel consumption. Everything in his life operated according to system and logic, which was exactly how he preferred it. The servants called him the Machine Duke, though never to his face. They said his heart was made of cold gears and unfeeling logic, that he calculated emotion the way other men calculated profit margins. They weren't entirely wrong. At 32, Brandon had perfected the art of emotional detachment. It was a necessary survival skill when one inherited a dukedom at age 12 and spent the next 2 decades cleaning up the catastrophic mess left by a father who'd been all passion and no sense. Love had driven his father to make disastrous investments, trust the wrong people, and nearly bankrupt one of England's oldest titles. Brandon had rebuilt the Alden fortune through ruthless efficiency and careful calculation. Sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford.
The letter arrived with the evening post, delivered on a silver tray by his butler. Brandon recognized his sister's handwriting immediately, Alexandra's elegant script, slightly smudged where her enthusiasm had outpaced the ink's drying time. He broke the seal and began to read. Dearest Brandon, I hope this letter finds you well, though I suspect you are currently sitting in your study at exactly 8 o'clock, surrounded by ledgers arranged in that impossibly neat way you insist upon. Am I correct? Of course I am. You are nothing if not predictable, dear brother. I write to you not with news but with a plea. Mamma has been speaking again about your need for a wife, and before you crumple this letter and toss it into the fire, I know you're considering it, please hear me out. Brandon had, in fact, been considering exactly that. He smoothed the paper with more force than necessary and continued reading. I know your thoughts on marriage, that it's a social obligation to be fulfilled with the same emotional investment one brings to signing a contract, that a wife should be selected based on breeding, temperament, and the ability to manage a household without requiring excessive emotional maintenance. But Brandon, I have watched you these past 20 years transform yourself into something that frightens me. You have become so efficient, so perfectly controlled, that I sometimes wonder if there's anything left inside you that remembers how to feel. Brandon's jaw tightened. Alexandra had always possessed an unfortunate talent for emotional manipulation disguised as sisterly concern. Tonight you attend the Christmas ball at your own manor. Every eligible lady in England will be there, and you will assess them with that calculating gaze you've perfected, weighing their dowries against their pedigrees. And you will choose someone suitable, someone who meets all your requirements, someone who will run your household with perfect efficiency and produce the requisite heirs without disturbing your carefully organized life. But Brandon, I beg you, choose someone with a soul. Choose someone who has known pain and survived it, someone who understands that life cannot be controlled with ledgers and logic, someone who might teach you that being broken doesn't mean being useless, and that love, messy, inconvenient, irrational love, is not weakness, but the greatest strength we possess. I know you think sentiment is a luxury, but I promise you, dear brother, loneliness is far more expensive than love could ever be. Your heart may be made of gears, but even machines need fuel to run, and you, my beloved machine duke, have been running on empty for far too long. With all my love, Alexandra. P.S. If you choose Lady Worthington's daughter Caroline because she speaks 4 languages and plays the pianoforte with mathematical precision, I shall never forgive you. That girl has all the warmth of a January frost and the soul of an account book. Brandon set the letter down carefully, his fingers resting on the paper as though weighing its contents. His first instinct was to dismiss Alexandra's romantic notions as the fantasies of a 19-year-old girl who'd read too many novels, but there was a quieter instinct, more troubling, that whispered she might be right. He stood and crossed to the window, looking out over the lamplit gardens where preparations for tonight's ball were reaching their conclusion. Hundreds of guests would arrive within the hour. He would assess them with cold calculation, selecting the one who best met his requirements for the position of Duchess of Alden, and he would feel absolutely nothing while doing it. Choose someone with a soul, Alexandra had written, someone who has known pain and survived it. He had no idea that within 3 hours he would find exactly that, a woman the world had dismissed as expired trash, standing in his ballroom, being sold like property, a woman whose pain was so profound that it radiated from her like heat from a forge, a woman whose soul had been battered but not broken. And for the first time in 20 years, the machine duke's perfectly controlled heart would malfunction entirely, choosing not with logic, but something far more dangerous, something that felt almost like rage on behalf of someone who could no longer rage for herself, something that felt almost like love. The ballroom at Alden Manor glittered like a jewel box, every surface reflecting candlelight until the entire space seemed to pulse with golden warmth. I stood near the servants' entrance, clutching Isabel's spare fan and shawl, watching the cream of London society whirl past in a kaleidoscope of silk and diamonds. Victoria had dressed me in my grey gown, the servant's uniform I'd worn for 8 years. No pretense tonight that I was anything other than what she'd made me, invisible, useful only for carrying things and fetching refreshments. Isabel danced with Lord Ashford, radiant in rose silk and the pearl necklace that had belonged to my mother. Victoria stood among a cluster of matrons, her smile brittle, her fan moving with agitated precision. I recognized that look, desperation masked as confidence. Lord Pemberton had arrived an hour ago, a portly man of 50 with cold eyes and a reputation for parsimony. He'd glanced at me once, assessing, the way one might evaluate a horse at auction. The music swelled, couples parted and reformed, and I tried to make myself even smaller against the wall. Perhaps if I was quiet enough, still enough, Victoria would forget her plan. Perhaps Lord Pemberton would find the arrangement distasteful and withdraw his offer. But then the music stopped. Not a natural pause between sets, but an abrupt cessation that sent confused murmurs through the crowd. Victoria stood at the edge of the dance floor, and she'd signaled the conductor to silence the orchestra. "My lords and ladies," Victoria's voice rang out with shocking clarity, "I beg your indulgence for this brief interruption to your evening's entertainment." The crowd turned toward her, curious and slightly scandalized. One did not commandeer the Duke of Alden's ball for personal announcements. "As many of you know," Victoria continued, her smile fixed and terrible, "I am a widow of modest means, doing my best to provide for my dear daughter Isabel." She gestured to Isabel, who looked confused and alarmed. "However, I find myself in a position that requires creative solutions to certain financial obligations." My stomach dropped. She wouldn't. Not here. Not in front of everyone. "To that end," Victoria said, her gaze finding me in my corner like a hawk spotting prey, "I am pleased to offer the services of my stepdaughter, Miss Naomi Middleton, to any gentleman or lady in need of a capable domestic servant." The ballroom erupted in shocked whispers. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, assessing, judging, some pitying, others merely curious about this spectacle. "Naomi is educated, literate, and experienced in household management," Victoria continued, as though she was selling livestock at market. "She is 28 years of age, unmarried, and unlikely to cause the complications that sometimes arise with younger staff. I am offering her services in exchange for the settlement of a debt owed to Lord Pemberton, £5,000 to be precise." "Victoria, what are you doing?" someone hissed, Lady Pemberton herself, mortified by the public display. But Victoria ignored her, emboldened by desperation. "Come now, surely someone here requires a competent housekeeper. She's quite hardy despite her plain appearance, and she eats very little. Consider it a charitable act, taking useless, expired trash and give it purpose." The words echoed through the ballroom, each syllable a lash. Useless, expired, trash. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, as 300 members of the ton stared at me with expressions ranging from horror to amusement. This was worse than being sold. This was being humiliated, dehumanized, reduced to an object in front of everyone who mattered in English society. Victoria turned to Lord Pemberton with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "My lord, I believe we had an agreement. She's yours if you'll forgive the debt." Pemberton stepped forward, looking me over with the same expression he might use when examining a piece of furniture. "She's rather thin. Will she be capable of heavy work?" Perfectly capable, Victoria assured him. 8 years of service in my household have made her quite durable. Very well, Pemberton said, withdrawing a document from his jacket. I'll take her. The debt is settled. And that was it. I had been sold. In front of the entire ton, in the Duke of Alden's ballroom, I had been reduced to chattel and purchased like a sack of grain. The whispers grew louder, some scandalized, others merely entertained by the drama. I saw Isabel's stricken face in the crowd, saw her turn away rather than meet my eyes. No one objected, no one intervened. I was nothing. I had always been nothing, and now everyone knew it. Then a voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. The crowd parted, and the Duke of Alden stepped into the space Victoria had claimed, his expression carved from ice and containing something that looked almost like fury. "The lady," he said, his cold gaze fixed on Victoria with predatory intensity, "is not for sale." The Duke of Alden moved through the crowd with the fluid precision of a predator, his evening clothes immaculate, his expression absolutely neutral except for something cold and deadly in his grey eyes. The whispers died as he approached, 300 guests collectively holding their breath. I had seen the Duke from a distance throughout the evening, tall, dark-haired, moving through his own ball with the detached efficiency of a man performing an obligation rather than enjoying a celebration. The Machine Duke, they called him, a man without warmth, without feeling, without mercy. He looked every inch that reputation now as he stopped directly in front of Victoria, who had gone pale beneath her rouge. "Your Grace," she said, attempting a curtsy that came off as more defensive than respectful, "I apologize for the disruption to your ball, but this is a private matter of debt settlement." "There is nothing private," Brandon said quietly, "about auctioning a woman in my ballroom." "She's my stepdaughter," Victoria protested. "I have every right—" "You have no rights here." His voice remained conversational, but something in his tone made Victoria take an involuntary step backward. "Lord Pemberton, I believe Lady Fairchild mentioned you were owed £5,000. Pemberton, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the attention, nodded. "Yes, Your Grace, but the arrangement has been settled." "It has not." Brandon turned his attention to me for the first time, and I felt the impact of his gaze like a physical thing. Those grey eyes swept over me with analytical precision, seeing everything, the grey servant's gown, the exhaustion beneath my composure, the 8 years of degradation written in the set of my shoulders. "Miss Middleton, I presume?" I managed a nod, my voice trapped somewhere between my chest and throat. "Tell me," he said, still looking at me rather than Victoria, "did you consent to this arrangement?" The question was so unexpected, so impossible, that I couldn't immediately process it. Consent? As though my consent had ever mattered? As though I were a person whose wishes carried weight rather than property to be disposed of at Victoria's whim? My voice came out as barely a whisper. "No, Your Grace." "She has no choice in the matter," Victoria interjected sharply. "I am her legal guardian until she marries, and I have determined this arrangement is in everyone's best interest." "Her best interest," Brandon said, each word precise as a surgical cut, "or yours?" Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Brandon reached into his jacket and withdrew a single gold sovereign, holding it up so the candlelight caught it, making it flash like a small sun. Then, with deliberate ceremony, he tossed it at Victoria's feet, where it rang against the marble floor and rolled to a stop against her silk slipper. "There," said Brandon, "I've purchased her." The ballroom erupted in shocked exclamations. Victoria stared at the coin as though it were a serpent. "Your Grace, that's hardly sufficient." "On the contrary," Brandon said, his tone suggesting he was explaining something to a particularly slow child. "You established her value yourself. Expired trash, I believe you called her. Surely trash is worth no more than a single coin." He turned to Pemberton. "My lord, I will settle Lady Fairchild's debt to you in full by week's end. You have my word." Pemberton, recognizing both dismissal and reprieve, bowed hastily. "Your Grace is most generous." "I am not generous," Brandon corrected. "I am appalled, and I am intervening in what appears to be a human rights violation occurring in my own home." He turned back to Victoria, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You came to my ball intending to sell a woman into servitude to settle your gambling debts. You publicly humiliated your stepdaughter, called her trash, and attempted to dispose of her like refuse. Did you truly believe I would permit such barbarity under my roof? She is nothing," she hissed, her composure finally cracking. "A burden, a waste, expired goods taking up space. She," Brandon interrupted, his voice cutting like ice, "is a woman, a human being, and she is now under my protection." He offered me his hand, and I stared at it as though it were an apparition. "Miss Middleton, would you do me the honor of accompanying me from this room? I believe you've endured quite enough for one evening." I looked at his outstretched hand, at Victoria's furious face, at the 300 witnesses to my humiliation and my impossible rescue. The machine duke, who felt nothing, who calculated everything, was offering me escape with the same precision he might use to solve an equation. I took his hand. His fingers closed around mine, warm and solid and real. "As for you, Lady Fairchild," Brandon said, turning once last to Victoria, "you are no longer welcome in my home or on any property I control. I suggest you leave immediately." And with that, the machine duke led me through the parted crowd, past the shocked faces and whispered exclamations, away from the woman who had tried to destroy me, and toward something I couldn't yet name, but felt almost like salvation.
Brandon led me through a side door into a smaller drawing room, away from the gawking crowd. My hand trembled in his, and I felt the shock beginning to set in, the trembling that started in my fingers and threatened to consume my entire body. I had been sold, rescued, purchased for a single coin like actual trash. "Sit," Brandon commanded, guiding me to a chair near the fireplace. His touch was impersonal but not unkind, the way one might handle something fragile that required careful positioning. I sat because my legs would no longer support me. Through the closed door I could hear the resumed music, the ball continuing as though nothing extraordinary had occurred, as though a woman hadn't just been auctioned in the middle of the ballroom. "I apologize for the spectacle," Brandon said, moving to a sideboard and pouring something amber into a glass. "But I needed witnesses for what comes next." He handed me the glass. "Drink. It will help with the shock." I took a sip and nearly choked on the burn of expensive whiskey. "Your Grace, I don't understand." "You will." He pulled a bell cord, and within moments his butler, Morrison, appeared, followed by a thin man in clerical dress carrying a leather-bound book that looked ancient and official. "Mr. Whitmore," Brandon said to the clergyman, "you have the registry." "Yes, Your Grace." The man set the book on a side table and opened it with reverent care. "Though I must say this is highly irregular." "Irregular, but legal," Brandon interrupted. "You've confirmed this." "Yes, Your Grace. The Royal Marriage Registry of 1653, established during the Commonwealth period and never formally revoked. It allows for immediate marriage without banns in cases of—" He hesitated, glancing at me. "In cases where a woman requires urgent protection from imminent harm or servitude." My whiskey glass nearly slipped from my numb fingers. "Marriage?" Brandon turned to me, his expression as neutral as ever, but something in his eyes suggested he was calculating risks and solutions with that machine-like precision he was known for. "Lady Fairchild sold you, Miss Middleton. That transaction, however morally reprehensible, has legal standing. You are technically her property until you marry or reach the age of majority, which at 28 you already have. However, she can argue you've been under her guardianship as an unmarried dependent. I don't—" "There is a loophole," he continued as though I hadn't spoken. "The 1653 registry allows for immediate marriage without consent of guardians in cases where a woman's freedom is under threat. By invoking this law and marrying you immediately, I remove you permanently from Lady Fairchild's control.
You become the Duchess of Alden, with all the legal protections and autonomy that title provides. I stared at him, unable to process what he was proposing. You want to marry me, a woman you just called trash in front of 300 people? I called you what she called you to make a point about her valuation, not mine, Brandon corrected with that infuriating precision. And I don't want to marry you out of desire or affection. I'm proposing a legal arrangement that solves both our problems. Both our problems? I echoed weakly. My sister has been pestering me to find a wife. You need permanent protection from Lady Fairchild and independence from anyone who might try to claim guardianship over you. This arrangement provides both. He pulled out his pocket watch and checked it. We have approximately 10 minutes before Lady Fairchild realizes what I'm doing and attempts to intervene with legal objections. I suggest we proceed immediately. Your Grace, Mr. Whitmore ventured nervously, perhaps the lady requires time to consider. Does she? Brandon turned those calculating grey eyes on me. Miss Middleton, in 10 minutes Lady Fairchild will either remove you forcibly from this house, or I will marry you and ensure she never touches you again. The choice is yours, but it must be made now. I thought of 8 years of servitude, of being called expired trash in front of everyone who mattered, of Victoria's face when she'd sold me for £5,000, of Lord Pemberton's cold assessment of my worth, and I thought of this strange, cold man who had stepped forward when no one else had, who had seen something worth protecting, even if he didn't feel anything while protecting it. "I'll marry you," I whispered. Brandon nodded once, as though I'd confirmed a calculation. "Mr. Whitmore, proceed." The ceremony took less than 5 minutes. I spoke vows I barely heard, signed my name in the ancient registry with shaking hands, and felt Brandon's cool fingers slip a ring onto mine, a simple gold band that looked like it had been pulled from his own signet collection. By the authority vested in me and the Royal Marriage Registry of 1653, I pronounce you man and wife. Brandon turned to Morrison. Inform the ballroom that I've just married Miss Middleton. Ensure Lady Fairchild hears it from multiple sources simultaneously. I want her to understand precisely how thoroughly she's lost. Morrison's lips twitched in what might have been approval. With pleasure, Your Grace. As the butler left, Brandon turned to me, his wife, though the word felt impossible, and spoke with the same detached precision he might use to discuss the weather. "You're safe now. Lady Fairchild has no legal claim on you. Lord Pemberton's arrangement is void, and as the Duchess of Alden you have autonomy and protection no one can challenge." "Why?" The word burst out before I could stop it. For the first time something flickered in those grey eyes. Not warmth exactly, but something that wasn't entirely cold. "Because," he said quietly, "because someone told me to choose a woman with a soul, someone who had known pain and survived it." His gaze held mine. "And you, Duchess, have survived what would have broken most people. I may not feel things the way others do, but I recognize strength when I see it." From the ballroom came the sound of raised voices, shock and outrage. Victoria had just learned she'd lost everything, and I, the expired trash she'd tried to sell, had just become the most powerful woman in the room. The Duke's carriage arrived at Oldham Estate just before dawn, the winter sun barely cresting the horizon as we passed through iron gates that seemed designed to keep the world at bay. I had spent the night in a guest chamber at the Duke's London townhouse, sleepless and disoriented, while Brandon dealt with the legal aftermath of our sudden marriage and Victoria's furious protests. Now, sitting across from my husband in the plush interior of his coach, I studied him in the grey morning light. He had been silent for most of the 2-hour journey, his attention fixed on correspondence he worked through with methodical efficiency. The machine Duke, working even in transit, calculating and organizing his life with the precision of clockwork. I was terrified of him. Not because he had been cruel, he hadn't been. Not because he had demanded anything of me, he'd barely spoken to me beyond logistical necessities. I was terrified because I didn't understand him, and after 8 years of learning to read Victoria's moods for survival, being unable to predict this man's intentions left me feeling helpless. What did he want from me? What would he expect? The marriage had been consummated only on paper. He'd made that clear last night, informing me with clinical detachment that the arrangement was legal protection, not a romantic union. But surely there would be expectations, demands, prices to pay for this rescue that seemed too extraordinary to be real. The estate emerged from the morning mist like something from a Gothic novel, all grey stone and towering windows, sprawling across manicured grounds that seemed to stretch forever. It was beautiful in a severe, imposing way, much like its master. "Welcome to Oldham," Brandon said, finally looking up from his papers. "Mrs. Crawford, the housekeeper, will show you to your chambers and help you settle in. I've instructed her to provide whatever you require." "Thank you, Your Grace," I murmured, the title feeling strange on my tongue when addressing my own husband. "Brandon," he corrected, absently, gathering his correspondence. "We're married. You should use my given name." The carriage stopped, and footmen materialized to open doors and lower steps. Brandon descended first, then turned to offer his hand with that same impersonal courtesy he'd shown throughout. I took it, stepping down onto gravel that crunched beneath my worn boots, still wearing the grey servant's dress from last night, still feeling like an impostor in Duchess's clothing. Mrs. Crawford waited at the entrance, a woman of perhaps 50, with steel grey hair and the bearing of someone who ran her domain with absolute authority. Her eyes swept over me with the same assessing quality as her master's, though hers held more warmth. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying, not to Brandon, but to me. The gesture made my chest tight with something I couldn't name. "Mrs. Crawford will see to your needs," Brandon said, already moving toward what I assumed was his study. "I have matters to attend to. We'll dine at 7 if you're feeling up to it. If not, a tray can be sent to your rooms." And just like that, he was gone, disappearing into his fortress with the efficiency of a man who had already mentally categorized our interaction and moved on to the next item on his agenda. Mrs. Crawford's expression softened slightly. "Come, Your Grace, let's get you settled. You've had quite a night, from what I understand." She led me through corridors that seemed designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, portraits of stern-faced ancestors watching our progress. We climbed a grand staircase and turned down a hallway that ended in double doors. "The Duchess's suite," Mrs. Crawford announced, opening them to reveal rooms that took my breath away. It wasn't the luxury that stunned me, though the space was beautiful, all soft blues and creams, with windows overlooking the estate's gardens and furniture that looked actually comfortable rather than merely expensive. It was the size. These rooms were larger than the entire attic I had occupied at Fairchild Manor. "The Duke's carriage is through that connecting door," Mrs. Crawford gestured, to a door on the far wall, "though he instructed me to tell you it remains locked from your side and will only be opened at your invitation. He was quite specific about that." "I don't understand," I whispered. Mrs. Crawford's expression gentled further. "His Grace is not like other men, Your Grace. He doesn't feel things the way most do, or perhaps he feels them but processes them differently. But he has rules he follows, principles he holds absolute. One of them is that power should never be used to harm those who have less of it. He married me out of principle. He married you because you needed protection, and he had the power to provide it. Whether that's principle or something else," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've served His Grace for 15 years. I've never seen him act impulsively. Everything he does is calculated. But last night, when he came home and gave orders for preparing these chambers, there was something in his voice I've rarely heard." "What?" I asked, desperate to understand this man who had upended my entire existence. "Anger," Mrs. Crawford said simply. "Cold, controlled, absolute anger at what had been done to you. His Grace doesn't rescue people on impulse, Your Grace. He identified an injustice and corrected it with the resources at his disposal. The question isn't why he did it, it's what you'll do with the freedom he's given you." She moved toward the dressing room. "Now, let's get you out of that dreadful grey dress and into something befitting a duchess. His Grace has arranged for a modiste to call this afternoon with fabrics and patterns. In the meantime, I took the liberty of having some things prepared that should fit reasonably well." As Mrs. Crawford bustled about, laying out clothes and explaining the household routines, I stood at the window looking out over grounds I was apparently now mistress of, wearing a ring that marked me as the Duchess of Olden, married to a man who treated me with terrifying respect but no apparent feeling. I was sold as trash and bought for a single coin. Now I lived in a palace, commanded servants, wore a title that made Victoria seem insignificant. But I had no idea whether I had been rescued or simply acquired by a more sophisticated owner. The connecting door remained closed, locked from my side, a silent promise of autonomy I wasn't sure I knew how to use.
Victoria arrived 3 days later, forcing her way past the butler with the imperious entitlement of someone who had not yet grasped how completely her world had shifted. I was in the morning room reviewing household accounts with Mrs. Crawford when Morrison appeared, his usual composure strained. "Your Grace, Lady Fairchild is demanding an audience. I've informed her that you are not receiving, but she has refused to leave the entrance hall." My stomach clenched with the old fear, the ingrained response to Victoria's presence, but Mrs. Crawford's hand touched my shoulder with gentle firmness. "You are the Duchess of Olden," she reminded me quietly. "She has no power here." I drew a breath and straightened my spine. "Show her in, Morrison, but remain within earshot." Victoria swept into the room moments later, her traveling cloak still fastened, her face tight with barely controlled fury. She stopped short when she saw me seated at the escritoire in a morning gown of soft lavender, the Olden diamonds at my throat, every inch the Duchess she had never imagined I could become. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with venom, "how remarkably you've landed on your feet, like a cat thrown from a window, somehow finding purchase where there should be none." "Lady Fairchild," I said, proud that my voice remained steady, "I'm surprised to see you. I thought His Grace made it clear you were not welcome." "His Grace," Victoria spat, moving closer with predatory intent. "Let's not pretend this farce is anything other than what it is, Naomi. The Machine Duke felt momentary pity and made an impulsive gesture he'll regret within a fortnight. Once the novelty wears off and he realizes what useless baggage he's acquired, you'll be set aside, pensioned off to some remote property where you won't embarrass him." The words found their mark, striking at fears I'd been harboring since that first night. What would happen when Brandon realized he'd shackled himself to damaged goods, when the calculated rescue became an inconvenient burden? "I came," Victoria continued, settling into a chair uninvited, "to discuss the financial arrangements. After all, I raised you for 8 years, housed you, fed you, provided for your education. Surely there should be some compensation for my investment now that you've married so extraordinarily well." I stared at her incredulous. "You want money? You tried to sell me 3 days ago, called me expired trash in front of 300 people, and now you want compensation?" "I want what I'm owed," Victoria said coldly. £10,000 seems reasonable, a small fraction of the Olden fortune, surely, and more than fair given my years of sacrifice on your behalf." Sacrifice, the word tasted like poison. You stole my inheritance, forced me into servitude, and attempted to sell me to settle your gambling debts. That's not sacrifice, Victoria. That's exploitation. You ungrateful wretch, Victoria's composure cracked, revealing the desperate fury beneath. Do you think he married you out of love, out of genuine feeling? He's a machine, Naomi. Everyone knows it. He calculated that acquiring a wife through this dramatic rescue would improve his reputation, make him seem more human.
You're a performance piece, a prop in his social theatre, and when the performance ends, you'll be discarded." The words hurt because they echoed my own fears. I had no illusions about Brandon's feelings. He'd been brutally honest about the transactional nature of our arrangement. But hearing Victoria weaponize that truth made something inside me harden. "Even if that were true," I said quietly, "I would still prefer being a duchess in a loveless marriage to being your unpaid servant. At least His Grace treats me with respect." "Respect?" Victoria laughed bitterly. "He treats his ledgers with respect. You're simply another asset he's acquired and catalogued. The moment you become a liability rather than a curiosity, you'll see his true nature." The door opened, and Brandon entered with the perfect timing of someone who had been listening from the corridor. His expression was neutral, but something cold flickered in his grey eyes. "Lady Fairchild," he said pleasantly, "I'm afraid you've been misinformed. My wife is not a curiosity or an asset. She is the Duchess of Olden, and you are trespassing in her home." "Your Grace, you have 30 seconds to leave my property before I have you forcibly removed and file charges for harassment. I suggest you use them wisely." Victoria stood, her face mottled with rage and humiliation. "This isn't over. I'll contest the marriage, prove it was entered under duress." "You may try," Brandon said, checking his pocket watch with theatrical precision. 20 seconds. Victoria fled, her dignity in tatters, and the silence that followed her departure felt heavy with unspoken questions. I looked at my husband, this man who felt nothing but had defended me with ruthless efficiency. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me," Brandon replied. "I simply removed a problem. It's what I do." But as he turned to leave, I saw his hand clench briefly at his side, the only sign that perhaps the machine duke felt more than he claimed.
The letter arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by a frantic messenger who'd ridden through the night. Brandon was in London on business, and I sat alone in the study that I'd gradually begun to think of as partly mine, reviewing correspondence that Mrs. Crawford had sorted into neat stacks. The handwriting was unfamiliar, young, slightly uneven with anxiety. "Your Grace, forgive my presumption in writing to you directly, but I have nowhere else to turn. My name is Alexandra Reed, and I am Brandon's sister. We have not yet met, though I have heard of your marriage and wish you every happiness. I write because I find myself in desperate circumstances. My mother, Lady Catherine Reed, has accumulated gambling debts that threaten to destroy what remains of our family's reputation. She has arranged for me to marry Lord Wickham, a man of 63 with a reputation for cruelty toward his previous wives. The betrothal is to be announced tonight at Lady Pemberton's ball. I know this is an unconscionable request to make of someone I've never met, but I have read of how you came to marry my brother. If there is any possibility that you might intervene or speak to Brandon on my behalf, I would be eternally grateful. I am 19 years old, and I am very frightened. Yours in desperate hope, Alexandra Reed." The words blurred as rage, clean, focused rage, unlike anything I'd felt before, crystallized in my chest. Another woman being sold, another debt being settled with human currency, another Victoria exploiting someone powerless to resist. I stood, the letter clenched in my hand, and rang for Morrison. "Have the carriage prepared immediately. I'm going to London." "Your Grace, His Grace left specific instructions that you were to remain. His Grace is not here. His sister is about to be sold to a monster, and I will not allow it. Prepare the carriage, now." Morrison's eyes widened, but he bowed. "At once, Your Grace." I arrived at Lady Pemberton's townhouse just as the evening festivities were beginning, still wearing my travelling clothes, but with the Olden diamonds blazing at my throat, a deliberate reminder of exactly who I was and what power I now commanded. The butler tried to deny me entry, but I simply walked past him with the imperious confidence Victoria had once wielded like a weapon. If she could weaponize entitlement, so could I.
I found them in the drawing room, Lady Catherine, a woman whose beauty was marred by weak, desperate eyes, and beside her a young woman who must be Alexandra. She had Brandon's dark hair and grey eyes, but where his were cold and calculating, hers were wide with barely suppressed panic. And across from them sat Lord Wickham, exactly as vile as I'd imagined, rheumy-eyed and leering, his gaze on Alexandra possessive and predatory. "Lady Catherine," I said, my voice cutting through the polite conversation like a blade. Every head turned toward me, Lady Catherine's face drained of colour. "Your Grace, this is a private family matter." "I am family," I said pleasantly, moving to Alexandra's side. The girl looked up at me with desperate hope, and I saw myself reflected in her fear. "Alexandra is my sister by marriage, which makes her welfare very much my concern." "The betrothal has been agreed upon," Lord Wickham said, his voice oily with false courtesy. "All arrangements have been finalized." "Nothing," I interrupted, "is finalized until contracts are signed and announcements made publicly, and I'm afraid there's been a complication." I withdrew a document from my reticule, one I'd had Morrison prepare during the frantic carriage ride, using the authority Brandon had legally granted me as his Duchess. "Lady Catherine, you owe Lord Wickham £15,000 in gambling debts, correct? Debts you plan to settle by offering your daughter in marriage." Lady Catherine's silence was confirmation enough. "I am prepared to settle those debts in full," I said, placing the document on the table between us. "In exchange, Alexandra will come to live at Alden Estate under my guardianship until she reaches her majority or chooses a husband of her own free will. The choice is yours, Lady Catherine, your daughter's freedom or your continued financial ruin." "You have no right," Wickham sputtered. "I have every right," I said, turning to him with a smile that held no warmth. "I am the Duchess of Alden. My husband controls more wealth than you could imagine, and he will support any decision I make regarding his sister's welfare. Unless you'd like to challenge the Duke on this matter." Wickham's face purpled, but he said nothing. No one challenged Brandon Reed. Lady Catherine looked between me and her daughter, and I saw the moment she made her calculation. "The debts will be settled immediately?" "Upon Alexandra's departure with me tonight." "Then we have an agreement." Alexandra's sob of relief was barely audible, but I heard it. I extended my hand to her, the same way Brandon had extended his to me in that ballroom. "Come," I said gently, "you're safe now." As we left, Alexandra's hand trembling in mine, I felt something shift inside me. For 8 years I had been powerless. For 8 years I had endured because I had no choice. But I had choices now. I had power now, and I would use it to ensure that no other woman would be sold the way Victoria had tried to sell me. The expired trash had become a shield for the vulnerable, and she would burn down anyone who tried to harm them. Brandon arrived home near midnight to find me in the library with Alexandra, who had fallen asleep on the settee with her head on my shoulder. I had been reading to her from a volume of poetry, the same winter poems that had once been my only comfort when exhaustion finally claimed her. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying the scene with that analytical gaze I'd come to recognize. Then something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like warmth. "You went to London," he said quietly, moving into the room. "Your sister wrote to me. She was being sold to Lord Wickham." I kept my voice low to avoid waking Alexandra. I couldn't let it happen. "So you intervened, used my name, my authority, and settled £15,000 of debt without consulting me." He settled into the chair opposite us, and I braced myself for anger, for some cold calculation that I'd overstepped. "Yes," I said, lifting my chin, "and I'd do it again." "Good," Brandon said simply. "That's what I hoped you'd do." I stared at him. "You're not angry?" "Angry?" He looked genuinely puzzled. "Why would I be angry that you protected my sister using resources I've made available to you? That's precisely the point of this arrangement, Naomi. You have power now. I expected you to use it. The use of my given name, spoken in that quiet tone, made something warm unfurl in my chest. Alexandra told me in her letter that you advised her to find someone with a soul, I said carefully, someone who had known pain and survived it. I did. Did you know you'd find that person the night of your ball? Brandon was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. No. I attended my own ball expecting to endure another tedious evening of evaluating suitable candidates. Then I watched a woman being auctioned like property, and something in my carefully organized logic fractured. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw past the machine duke to the man beneath. I've spent 20 years eliminating emotion from my decisions, but watching what Victoria did to you made me feel something I'd thought I'd successfully excised. Rage. Pure, illogical rage. The machine duke felt something, I said softly. The machine duke, he replied with the ghost of a smile, malfunctioned rather spectacularly. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather document folder, setting it on the table between us. I've been in London settling several matters. Victoria's debts have been paid in full, by me, not her. In exchange, I've taken possession of certain assets. I opened the folder with trembling hands and found myself staring at a deed. Fairchild Manor, my father's house, the house I'd been born in, had been enslaved in, had nearly been destroyed in. It's yours, Brandon said. Not mine, not ours, yours, in your name alone. Victoria and Isabel have been given notice to vacate within the month. I've also recovered your mother's jewelry, the books from your father's library that Victoria sold, and several other items that belonged to your family. They're being transported here as we speak. Tears blurred my vision. Why? Because they're yours. They were stolen from you, and I'm simply returning what should never have been taken. He paused. And because I wanted you to have something that was entirely your own, not given by me, not dependent on our marriage, but yours by right. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. He stood, preparing to leave me to my privacy as he always did, maintaining that careful distance between us. Brandon, his name stopped him at the door. Stay, please. He turned, surprise flickering across his features. These past weeks, you've given me safety, autonomy, respect, and now justice. You've asked for nothing in return, but I find myself wanting to give you something anyway. You don't owe me. Not because I owe you, because I choose to. I stood carefully, leaving Alexandra sleeping on the settee. You said you don't feel things the way others do, but I've watched you, Brandon. I've seen how you treat your servants with fairness, how you protect your sister, how you intervened when I was being destroyed. You feel things, you just process them differently. Naomi.
I'm falling in love with you, I said, the words both terrifying and liberating. Not because you rescued me, not out of gratitude or obligation, but because you've shown me what it means to be truly seen. You looked at the woman everyone called trash and saw someone worth protecting. You gave me power and trusted me to use it wisely. You asked for nothing and gave me everything. Brandon stood frozen, his careful control visibly wavering. I don't know how to love someone properly. I don't know if I'm capable of the kind of feeling you deserve. Then we'll figure it out together, I said, crossing to him and taking his hand. You taught me that being broken doesn't mean being useless. Let me teach you that feeling things imperfectly is better than not feeling at all. His fingers tightened around mine, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that sounded almost like wonder.
When I bought you for that single coin, I thought I was making a calculated decision, a logical solution to an unjust situation. He lifted my hand to his lips, the gesture tender and entirely unpracticed. I didn't realize I was choosing my future, choosing you. 3 months later, we returned to Fairchild Manor together. Victoria and Isabel were gone, their belongings cleared and their presence erased. The house had been cleaned and restored, and I walked through rooms that had once been my prison with my husband at my side. In my mother's old sitting room, now restored to its original beauty, I found Brandon standing at the window, looking out over gardens that were being replanted. "No regrets?" he asked. I thought of the girl I'd been, invisible, broken, convinced she was worthless. I thought of the auction, the humiliation, the single gold coin that had purchased my freedom. And I thought of the man beside me who had seen trash and chosen to see treasure instead. "None," I said, taking his hand. "Not a single one." The machine duke smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes and pulled me close. And if his heartbeat was a little too fast, a little too human for someone supposedly made of gears, well, that was a malfunction neither of us had any intention of fixing. Our time together is ending, but the scandal doesn't have to. If your heart is still racing, don't let it die here. The 2 stories on your screen are darker, deeper, and even more irresistible. Subscribe so we don't lose each other. Then click 1 now. Your next obsession is waiting.